Well, good morning. We're in the middle of the Memorial Day weekend, and I'll have more to say about that a little later. Our first subject this morning is UP history. Our guest will have some interesting stories to share, and it all starts right now.
From TV6, this is The Ryan Report. Now, here's your host, Don Ryan.
Although Professor Russell Manake was born and raised in San Francisco and attended the University of San Francisco and St. Louis University, he probably knows more about the history of Upper Michigan than anyone. He came to Marquette on a visit and later was hired and joined the faculty at Northern Michigan University in 1969. Since then, he's not only taught history, he's written extensively, was appointed university historian, director of the Center for Upper Peninsula Studies, and also served as the interim head of the Departments of History and Philosophy at NMU. We invited him to join us today so we could share some of that knowledge of UP history. He's published a number of books, including one that's just coming out. We'll talk about that book in a few minutes. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Okay, well, thank you.
With that introduction, you came from San Francisco. How did you wind up in Marquette?
Well, it's kind of an interesting story. I came up with a friend who had been hired in the middle of the year at Northern, and he was from Mississippi. I'm from California. And we arrive in Marquette in the middle of a horrific snowstorm. We didn't have the brains to stop and say, you know, there's something wrong here. And we came in, and I had a very nice time. And in the few days I was here, I tried to see as much of the UP as possible. We actually went up the Keweenaw Peninsula at the end of January and got up, I think, to we were going to go to Copper Harbor. We didn't make it. And then, so I tried to see as much of, and the whole idea while I was in graduate school in the Midwest, I was going to go back to California. I wanted to see as much of the country as possible.
So, were you ever tempted to leave, or were you pretty solid here once you settled in at Northern Michigan University?
Well, when I started out, I was teaching Spanish in America, Latin American history, and there wasn't a great demand for it. And then a good friend of mine, Robert Archibald, we were at a meeting and he said, why don't you get into local history and so on? And I always had an interest in local history out in California and so on. And so I kind of shifted my direction and went into local history, and he said, you know, the research materials are close by, there's probably monies that you can apply for and so on, and you'll get a reputation and you'll preserve the history of the area. So I started in the mid-70s working at it, but it was I was starting from the bottom because for people that are born and raised in the Upper Peninsula, you grow up, you go to Mackinac Island, you go to the Copper Country and so on, and I hadn't done any of that. But though when I first arrived in the fall of '69, I did kind of make a circle tour, and I saw all the major areas of the Upper Peninsula. So I wanted to know the history of the place because I was living here. So what happened around me and so on.
Some people think the history of the UP goes back to the 1800s, but in fact, it probably goes back at least 10,000 years, right?
Well, when you include you go back to the Indian sites that they've uncovered, many of them in recent years up in the Negaunee area, and then you also have the Copper Indians. It goes back several thousand years. As soon as the glaciers receded, Native Americans moved into the area. Basically, their culture was based on hunting, fishing, gathering.
And for a big part of that history, the history of the UP and the Native American history are very closely entwined. Isn't that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. And the fur trade, the French came into the area in the 1600s and developed the fur trade, and the fur trade became a global enterprise. And then the English took over, and then the Americans continued with the fur trade, and so there was this constant interaction between the Euro-Americans and the Native Americans. And what's kind of interesting about that is that much of their culture, even though they lose their land and so on, lots of it, they did continue their traditional lifestyle. hunting, gathering, selling blueberries, fish, and so on to the white population. And then you had Indians growing potatoes that were introduced and then selling them to the mining community. So yes, there has been this interaction that, and we tend to forget about it, but continues up to the present day.
I'm afraid this is one of those subjects there's just so much to talk about. We're just going to scratch the surface today. We already have to take a break. We'll be back with more questions for Dr. Manake after we take this break. We're talking with Dr. Russ Manake from Northern Michigan University. And first of all, I should point out that you've actually retired from teaching at Northern, I understand?
On the 16th of December was my termination time.
But you're still active as the university historian and obviously active in many ways.
Right, and then kind of the big reason for retiring was to have time to finish off a lot of book projects that I have out there or have ideas to start even.
Okay. We were chatting before about food in the UP. What can you tell us about the history there?
Well, one of the things that I was when I got into the history of the Upper Peninsula, I began to look at areas that hadn't been touched in the past, and one was the history of food. And I remember a colleague went and looked at me. He said, "Well, who cares about the food in the Upper Peninsula?" Well, when you actually get into it, and that would be a response to a person that doesn't know anything about it, when you get into the history of food, beginning with Native Americans, the French who come in, the various ethnic groups and so on, you have a very, very interesting and rich history of both food and beverage in the area.
You've written this book called Upper Peninsula Beer, A History of Brewing Above the Bridge. And I find it fascinating because, not so much because it's beer, but as we look at the brewing industry, all of these little breweries started at one time. We grew these major breweries. Now they've all been kind of swallowed up into one or two, and now we're starting the whole process again. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, absolutely. It's and the microbreweries that have developed, and we had 13 when I started writing the book last year, and by the time I got done, we had another 4.
When we go back in the earlier history, back in that middle 1800s period, a lot of the people who came here came from Germany and settled in this area originally to work in the mines, but many of them then, according to your book, went off and opened their own breweries and were fairly successful. Is that the story?
Yeah, in the 19th century, there were breweries. The Copper Country had the largest number of them, at least a half dozen, and they would pop up in different communities. Marquette had one, the old castle structure that was west of town, and they were all German brewers. And what's interesting, I found that the first German brewer was Nicholas Volker, the grandfather of John Volker.
Okay.
And he and two associates, started making beer at Sault Ste. Marie in 1850. And then they moved to the Copper Country, opened up breweries there, and then as Germans arrived, many of them got into brewing.
I don't think we think of the Copper Country as a place particularly known for brewing, but there were some breweries that did very well. Haas Brewery, I think, was one that's written up in your book, and
Correct.
of course the Busch Brewing Company, or Bosch.
Or Bosch, yes.
I do remember the old commercials on TV6 at one time that said, "Busch or Bosch, we all agree, best beer in the whole UP."
Correct.
So,
Yep.
but kind of trace the history of how those companies. Well, and one of the big concerns, of course, was Prohibition. They were doing well, and then Prohibition came along, and many of them went out of business permanently.
Right. The brewery started, as I said, in 1850, and then just took off after that. And then everything was going along very well until Prohibition came, and that was May 1st, 1918. And Michigan got into Prohibition before national Prohibition. And everything shut down, and the breweries then became soda companies making bottled soda water and whatnot. And the whole brewing industry died, and then at the end of Prohibition, they, some of the breweries got back into business, but they didn't have the advertising ability and the funds and so on, and so they were pretty much squeezed out. I think the last two were Haas and Bosch. And I think Bosch went out in the 1970s. That was kind of the end of it. Then it was about 25 years before 1994, and we get the first brewery in the UP.
I noticed in your book that Michigan almost went dry earlier. They had a vote in 1877, and it came very close to passing. So,
yes.
So Michigan could have been a dry state long before.
And
Prohibition came along.
and with some of those votes, the Upper Peninsula kept the state wet.
Okay.
And it was pretty much the Upper Peninsula counties. At that time, we had a very, very large ethnic population, and the Germans and beer, Italians and others with wine, and so there was it was just part of the local culture. So when you all of a sudden told people to give up this culture, they voted to stay wet.
The whole trend now toward the microbreweries and brew pubs really started in the 70s, 80s, in that period?
It began in the UP. It began in 1994. Hefferton Hops down in Escanaba. They were the first brew pub. And then the Verling here in Marquette, Terry Doyle started soon after. Some of these started within months of each other, and then the brewery in Grand Marais. Those were the first three that came about in the 90s. And then the other breweries that have come on have been a more recent vintage.
And I picked up in your book that Michigan is now 5th in the nation in microbreweries with 150.
Correct.
So.
And it's, there's kind of an ongoing debate with the state of Colorado. They're upset with Michigan being number 5, and they want to be number 5, and so there's a lot of sparring that goes on as to who's up there.
It's a fascinating history, and again, it's available in a new book just put out by Dr. Manake. It's called Upper Peninsula Beer, A History of Brewing Above the Bridge. We'll be back with more questions and answers on today's Ryan Report after we take this break. We're talking with Dr. Russell Manake, retired professor at Northern Michigan University, but very active on the history scene today. I was just thinking about the UP. We call it someplace special. I imagine a lot of places, people do that as well, but we truly are someplace special. But certainly the ethnicity must have contributed to that process of making us who we are with the immigrants who came from so many different countries.
Correct. And the other thing is that the Upper Peninsula is someplace special. It is an entity that you don't find in other states, and you can, go and look. You don't find it. And then we had this large ethnic population that came up, brought its culture, its heritage, and so on, language, and gave the place a kind of a unique feature.
I was a little surprised in your book that among the earliest ethnic groups were the Jewish, African American, and French Canadians.
Correct.
That really
Yes.
surprised me.
Yep.
And that is accurate.
Yep. We had the French Canadians
That
came.
one
Is known, but then we had African Americans that came first as slaves. The French and English brought them up, and then others came up here, interestingly, as part of the Underground Railroad, fleeing the South, and they could either go to Canada or come to an out-of-the-way place like the UP. So we had kind of a large, percentage-wise, a large African-American population in 1860 up here.
Of course, we went on to Scandinavians and Irish and Germans and Italians, and really became a melting pot.
Well, I figure there's, I think in Marquette there were like 50 of various sizes, but 50 ethnic groups that you can count up that were living in Marquette County.
On this Memorial Day weekend, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the history of war, the world wars, World War I, World War II. very different than what we experience today. In fact, the whole nation went to war. Is that
Correct.
Is that a fair statement?
That's correct, and we're celebrating, well, we're going to be celebrating the next year or so when the United States enters World War I in April 1917. And for instance, there was a concern because we had Germans, we had Austrians, we had people from, you might say, the enemy side in World War I, and there was a question, are they going to, join the war effort? And they all did. And but you had, in both wars, you had total involvement of the community with victory gardens. You read the newspapers, there were special recipes for the use of maple syrup in place of sugar, and less meat, and so on. So it was a total involvement. You knew you were at war.
People
and
had
you were part of it.
rationing. You had to have stamps to be able to buy certain products, gasoline, food.
Right. Your entire life was surrounded by the war and the whole war effort.
And the Upper Peninsula certainly made a contribution to that effort. We think of the iron mines, but there was much more than that.
Well, originally when I kind of got into studying World War II in the UP, I figured, well, the middle of the country, not much happened. And then I found that we had 5 prisoner of war camps. We had a huge concentration of men and women at Sault Ste. Marie guarding the canal. We had one of 3 very severe conscientious objector camps. We had a lot of local industry. Probably the biggest was the Ford glider plant in Kingsford. And a lot of cottage industries in the different communities producing things, parts for equipment or mosquito netting.
I noticed in one of your earlier books, you talked about a dress manufacturer receiving orders for uniforms on Baraga Avenue in Marquette.
Right.
And a plant in Negaunee making some nurses' uniforms, I believe it was.
Right.
There were just so many ways that the whole country became involved.
Yeah, what happens is when you get into it, you find that, every nook and cranny that you look at was in some way involved. If a guy in some of these plants had converted to making uniforms and nurses' clothing, or people working in their garages, making nuts and bolts and whatnot, but being involved and wanting to be involved,
Why is history important? We have only a minute. Why is it important that we observe history, that we learn history, that we celebrate history?
Well, it gives you sort of a sense of place. You're at this place. Well, what happened at this place? What was the involvement? And how were you and your family? How were they involved in the local history? If you're Finnish and you're in the UP, how did the Finns fit in? And then you look at the history and see how you have fit into it.
Well, it's fascinating, and I've got papers all over my desk and a few of your books spread out here. I took some time to read them this week, and it's a lot of very interesting material, and really appreciate your coming in this morning and talking with us.
Okay, thank you.
Our guest has been Dr. Russell Manake. I'll be back with some thoughts about Memorial Day after we take this break. As we observe this Memorial Day, it's fair to say that often the emphasis is on the fact that it's the first holiday weekend of the summer. And that's not a bad thing. Certainly we've waited for it. What is unfortunate is the fact that this holiday has a much deeper meaning that's sometimes forgotten, honoring those who made the ultimate sacrifice for all of us. Memorial Day was originally called Decoration Day and was intended as a day of remembrance for those who died in service of the United States. Decoration Day was born out of the Civil War and was officially proclaimed on May 5, 1868 by General John Logan, National Commander of the Grand Army of the Republic. General Logan said, "The 30th of May, 1868 is designated for the purpose of strewing with flowers or otherwise decorating the graves of comrades who died in defense of their country during the late rebellion, and whose bodies now lie in almost every city, village, and hamlet, churchyard in this land." Well, during this morning's show, we talked about the role people of the Upper Peninsula played in World War II. As fighting raged in other parts of the globe, those at home were also impacted. While American soldiers and their families did make the ultimate sacrifice by giving their lives for their country, many average citizens were also called on to make sacrifices and to contribute to the war effort. Those efforts ranged from rationing of foods, gasoline, and other products to stepped-up production to provide materials needed for the war effort. Iron ore was just one prime example. There were many others. Everyone on the home front was well aware of the commitment being made by the men and women in uniform and were doing their best to support them. Two things have changed dramatically in the conduct of war since World War II. First, with modern technology and our news gathering capabilities today, the war is virtually brought into our living rooms by extensive television news coverage. The other concerns the fact that in recent wars, the rest of us, the average citizens, have not had to make that kind of sacrifice that were evident in the Second World War. For those not directly involved, life goes on as usual. On the surface, that sounds like a good thing, but when we consider how serious war really is, perhaps it would be better if we all had to make some sacrifice to support the effort and to remind us of the commitment being made by others. One thing has not changed. The men and women who have given their lives for this country and their families in every war have made the ultimate sacrifice. They deserve to be remembered and thanked every day, and especially on this Memorial Day weekend. I'll be back in just 2 minutes. Before we go this morning, I would again like to remind you that if you missed this show, want to watch it again, or recommend it to someone else, it is available on the internet. Just go to uppermichigansource.com. The latest version is usually available starting at about noon tomorrow. And if you have some thoughts you want to share with us, our email address is theryanreport@chesstv.com. I'd like to hear from you. Thanks to Dr. Russell Manake for joining us this morning. We've only had a chance to scratch the surface as far as his knowledge of UP history goes. If you're interested in more, check out some of his books. They're available at many local bookstores, and if not, you can certainly find them online. As we wrap it up this morning, once again, remember, this is Memorial Day weekend. Take time to remember those who have given so much to protect our freedom. The Today Show is standing by and anxious to get started, so enjoy the rest of your day, and please join us next Sunday morning.